For the rest of the lymphatic and immune system chapter, we're going to be considering the immune system. So first we want to think about what the functions are of that system and then move on to an overview of what's going on in the system. The immune system, which is really just a functional system, which we'll talk about soon enough, is really there to protect us against damage and disease in our body. That can be highlighted in a few ways. The immune system protects us from environmental agents. Usually we think of pathogens, but there are chemical agents that can be equally problematic. The immune system is also very important for differentiating between what is the self, what is our body, from the molecular level to the organ level, and what is not. So non-self things. Those could be transplanted tissues, those could be those could be pathogens. There are a number of things that would count as non-self there. And then the immune system also helps to clear away expired cells, like red blood cells that have lived through their 120-day lifespan, and other cellular debris just as tissues break down from use and age. In this section and the next section, we're going to consider some aspects of immune function, just overview type things. This one is going to look at what immune function is in a big picture, and then the next section is going to look at what are the things that our immune system is fighting against, specifically pathogens. The immune system is different from the other systems that we've been looking at, and really it seems like it should have its own chapter in the book, rather than being tied with the lymphatic system, or vice versa. The reason for that is that the immune system is a functional system. It's not a system the same way as the cardiovascular system and the nervous system, which has a very specific anatomy to it. A lot of the function of the immune system is going to be taking place because of white blood cells, and obviously they are blood cells, and they move through the blood via cardiovascular transport. So in that sense, the immune system relies on the cardiovascular system for the structures that make it possible. The cardiovascular system loses water into the tissues of our body, and that water is reclaimed through lymphatic organs, which makes it possible for the immune system to perform immune surveillance, you could say, as well as play some of the roles in helping to clear cellular debris and those sorts of things out of the body. And so lymphatic organs are very important, but they aren't the only part of the system. In other places, we have cells that are called dendritic cells. We'll actually look at those in some detail later on in this chapter. But in the skin or the mucous membranes of the digestive, reproductive, respiratory, or urinary systems, there are these specialized cells that help to alert the rest of the immune system to the presence of potential disease-causing agents. And then, like I said earlier, the cardiovascular system loses water into various tissues, which is what we call interstitial fluid. And interstitial fluid is in all of our tissues. There are aspects of immune function that take place within that interstitial fluid. So we can say that there's immune function everywhere in the body to some degree. All anatomy is involved in immune function. So it's not the same as the types of systems that we've been looking at in this course so far. We want to keep in mind that the immune system works as an integrated whole, which is to say that the immune response is just one big response. We're going to break it down into different parts, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. Even though it's easiest for us to understand by breaking the immune response down in different parts, we have to remember that it's all one big system. This is an overview of the structure of the immune system and sort of how we're going to look at it. There's two major components of it, which again are not separate parts of the immune system. They work together, and we want to consider them individually to learn their components, but then we also want to think about how they integrate together to make the entire immune response. Innate immunity is what we're born with, which is what innate means. It can also be referred to as non-specific immunity, which means that it's not immunity against the influenza virus or E. coli specifically, but rather the responses that we see generally to any kind of threat to our body. It's an immediate response. In that way, it's the first thing to come around. Not that it's separate from the rest of it, but it can be on the scene, so to speak, faster than other things can. The passive aspect of the innate immune system, what we can consider the first line of defense, is what's already present there, the physical structures of our body. And that would be the skin and the various mucosal membranes making up barriers. When we think of what is ourself and what's not ourself, at the cognitive level, we usually have an impression of our body mostly defined by where our skin ends. But really, at an immunological level, self and non-self identity can be defined as what's within our skin, as well as the space beyond the mucosal membranes. The lumen of your digestive tract is not any different from the outside world as far as our immune system is concerned. You could really put anything you want down your digestive tract. As long as it doesn't cross that mucosal barrier, it's okay. And if you want to take an extreme example, sword swallowing, for instance. Somebody putting a sword down their digestive tract. As long as it doesn't breach the digestive mucosa, it's not going to cause problems. That's passive. It's just there. Now, these barriers are somewhat active in the sense that they secrete things. So mucosal membranes secrete mucus, and then other barriers like the conjunctiva of the eye secrete tears. There's saliva in the mouth, etc., etc. A lot of those secretions are meant to catch and wash away or clear away pathogens that might be trying to get through those barriers. The secretions, for instance, on the skin, while they're not really washing things away, because that would make the outside of our body kind of slimy and gross, they do inhibit microbial growth by having a slightly lower pH than what bacteria want to live in, the bacteria that want to get into our body. We call that the acid mantle, about a 6.5 pH as opposed to 7.35 inside of our body. There are also secretions of enzymes and other components that are antimicrobial in a more active sense, in that they destroy things. The active component of innate immunity can be considered the second line of defense. When things get past the barriers that I just talked about, then we have several things that can help get rid of those infections. First, there's the inflammatory response, which to some degree kind of controls a lot of the other things that are going to happen, or makes them possible at least. Can help to clear away pathogens as they get into the system. There are cells that actively hunt down and destroy pathogens and also remove cellular debris and those sorts of things. There are phagocytes, which are white blood cells that eat things, which is what phago refers to. And then NK cells are natural killer cells, which are a specific type of white blood cell that can target diseased or damaged cells in the body and get rid of them. We're really going to save talking about NK cells until we get to the other aspect of immunity, because they're largely used as a tool by other white blood cells to help fight off disease and infection. And then also actively, there are a couple of chemicals, complement and interferons. Complement is a specific cascade of proteins that help to destroy cellular pathogens, which usually means bacteria. And then interferons are hormones that are used to communicate within immune responses. There are three major types. We're going to consider one of them that's specific in responding to viral infection. Adaptive immunity is the other part of the immune response. Innate means what you're born with. Adaptive has to adapt to your environment. It has to learn the difference between self and non-self. For the first 6 months, 2 years of life, the adaptive immunity is learning about your environment. And so it's not ready to even do anything until that happens. It is a specific response. So when you're infected by the influenza virus or by E. coli, this is the directed attack on that pathogen. It can take a little while before it has an effect and clears away the pathogen, but it's much more successful in some of the harder infections that we might deal with. For adaptive immunity, passive and active mean something a little bit different, whereas in innate immunity, passive components were things that were just there, and they were protective just because of their existence. And active were the things that actively helped fight off infection. Here, passive and active actually is referring to where the specific immunity is coming from. And within each, we can think of there as being a, quote, natural or, quote, artificial version of each. Now, for passive adaptive immunity, this is how you get immunity to something when you don't have your own immunity to it. The first 6 months to 2 years of life, like I said before, the adaptive immunity isn't even functional. And so a naturally acquired passive immunity is where you get the specific immunity from your mother in utero and also through breast milk postnatally to make sure that you're immune to things in the environment, because your mother and you should both be living in the same environment, and so whatever she's immune to is what you can be immune to. There are also situations where adaptive immunity, being a rather gradual response, isn't fast enough to deal with things. For instance, if you're bit by a venomous snake venom toxin is going to have an effect, potentially fatal effect, faster than the adaptive immune system can react to it. And so snake venom toxin can be counteracted through a snake bite kit with a serum containing antibodies to that. So that's a therapeutic intervention when your body isn't capable of taking care of it. The active component of adaptive immunity is when your lymphocytes are making antibodies or other molecules that confer that immunity to specific pathogens. The natural type is, in fact, how you respond to exposure to a pathogen. You get exposed to something, takes a couple of weeks, but the adaptive immunity comes online and is able to fight it off. Then subsequent exposures to the same thing are going to be less symptomatic, possibly non-existent, because you have that immunity. For instance, if you're exposed to chickenpox when you're young, you get the pox, you're sick, it's not fun, but you won't be affected by chickenpox again in the future. There are some situations where you might be, but generally speaking, you develop an immunity to it after your initial exposure. Artificial active adaptive immunity is when you're exposed to a non-virulent form of the pathogen to develop the immunity before you ever get exposed to it in a regular situation. That is a vaccine. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. While adaptive immunity is becoming functional in the first 6 months to 2 years of life or so, the antibodies that you have are made by your mother. You get most of them from her through placental transfer in utero, though some can be transferred in breast milk as well. The other examples that we see here, A represents the so-called artificial passive version of adaptive immunity. B is the so-called artificial version of active adaptive immunity, and D represents innate immunity.